The getAttribute function can be very useful, but there is another, even more general function that I'd like to look at. You might recall that when we configured our tank farm, the level attribute of every tank, in fact, looks up its own pi tag using some syntax. Here it's the name of the element, .level, for every tank. And we're looking at tank 1 right now, so this resolves correctly to the pi tag of tank1.level. The way this happens behind the scenes is, in the AF SDK, this shows up as, let me create a dummy method here to hold this. A static method on the AF data reference type, AF data reference.substitute parameters. So in other words, if we pass in a string, something like %element% dot level, and our own data reference, this whole thing would resolve to something like tank1.level, exactly how it works in the PyPoint data reference. So if you're trying to do something like that and either point at the name of an element or something along those lines, this works great. In fact, for a complete list of what all is possible, the help in PySystem Explorer contains a listing. In that help, there is a list of PyAF substitution parameters. So exactly as we saw, there's good old element name. Of course, we can also do relative paths from here, and, if we want, even pull values from attributes. Imagine the case where our tank, instead of having super friendly pi tags like tank1.level, in fact has pi tags more along the lines of like the tank's ID number .level. If we have that ID number exposed here as an attribute, then we can involve it as a substitution parameter. In that case, it would just be like %at ID code %. And then we'd look up the value of that attribute and use it in our substitution parameters result. Of course, you might be looking at this going, wait a minute, you're telling me that every time a client wants to resolve the pi tag behind level, we have to do all sorts of resolution and going and getting values? That sounds very inefficient. Well, yeah, it is. But thankfully there's a very good way to have the flexibility of using substitution parameters, but persist the results as desired. For example, with the PyPoint data reference. Right now, if I'm looking at the tank level, I have %element%.level, now that's my substitution parameter right there. But there's an option in PySystem Explorer for me to go in and either at the attribute level do a create or update, or even at the entire element or whatever level, run a create or update. So if I do that, and create or update any data references, there we go, it looks at level, and for some reason ignores the other, we'll see why, and says that configuration succeeded. Perfect. Now if I look at that attribute configuration, it's actually hard-coded, resolved once and for all as tank1. Cool. So we used the substitution syntax to get us there, but then there is some unknown feature that allows us to run a create or update of our data reference configuration. In fact, how that works behind the scenes is another virtual method that we can implement in our data reference. So in our data reference, if we wanted to, we could implement the virtual method createConfig. And this would allow us to, for example, run that substitute parameters and then of course do something with the result. Not that we really need the result of that, but you get the idea in general. CreateConfig can also be used to, in the case of the PyPoint data reference, create PyTags, or in the case of some data reference that contacts a foreign system, perhaps run some maintenance or configuration procedure on that foreign system. In our case, this CreateConfig thing is useful for perhaps persisting the results of substitution parameters until CreateConfig is called again. If we implement CreateConfig, then really the last thing to do is to adjust our supported methods to tell the SDK that yes, we have implemented this CreateConfig and AF clients are allowed to call it. You recall just a minute ago when PySystem Explorer really ignored all of my attributes except for the one with the PyPoint data reference. Well, of these attributes, that's the only one that has that flag where it supports or implements the CreateConfig method. All the others don't have that flag, so System Explorer was smart enough to know that they can't be CreateConfigged. Of course here, I'm going to revert us to our original state of not implementing CreateConfig or having this dummy method here. And with that, we can continue to the final step, which will be building a graphical editor for this data reference.